Welcome to this episode of Unraveling Adoption, an intentional space to delve into adoption's complexities together. I am Beth Syverson, an adoptive mom of a smart and intuitive 19-year-old son, Joey, who is trying very hard to launch into adulthood. I am walking beside him while working on my own personal growth and healing. We are committed to helping anyone touched by adoption, and we want to help the general public understand adoption's complexities better too. Today's guest is Damon Davis, a domestic same-race adoptee, and a parent of a biological child and 2 kinship adoptive children as well. He had a joyous reunion with both of his birth parents, the kind many adoptees dream of. He hosts a podcast called Who Am I Really?, which is centered on adoptee search and reunion stories primarily. And he wrote a wonderful memoir with the same name, Who Am I Really? Thank you for joining me here at Unraveling Adoption, Damon. So glad to have you here.
Thank you so much for the invitation, Beth. I really appreciate it. This is great. Thank you.
Yeah. Your podcast and your book are just both really inspirational to me, and I dig it all, and I'm just happy to get to know you a bit. We met in Louisville at the summit.
Unraveling Adoption.
No, that's my podcast name. Untangling Your Roots.
It was Untangling Your Roots. We're unraveling, we're untangling, we're doing all kinds of
it's all good.
Taking apart. Untangling our roots.
Yeah. Yes. So that was very nice to meet you and so many other people that I've only heard in my ears all these times. So great to have you. And I want to talk to you about that unique position you have as an adoptee, adoptive parent, and a parent of a biological child. But first, I think maybe we should let people know kind of where you're coming from, what your story is. So can you give us a brief synopsis of your adoption story?
Sure. I'll tell you the quick version. And the quick version is exactly the reason why I do the podcast, because this is often what we do. We always tell the quick story and we don't get to dive into the details.
Yes.
But the general gist of my story is I was raised, as you've said, same race adoption in Columbia, Maryland. And I had a wonderful life growing up, and I was perfectly comfortable being an adoptee. You know, it was not a taboo subject in my house. And as a matter of fact, my adoptive mother told me that if I ever wanted to search at a later date, that she would help me. And there was no restriction on it either. She never said like when you're 18 or any of the things that some people do hear from their parents. And so I never really wanted to. I was always of the opinion, I have 2 parents. I don't need to find 2 more. Mm-hmm. But as I grew older and I got married, you know, we adopted my niece and nephew on my wife's side of the family. They came to us from the Caribbean, where they had bounced around the family quite a bit. So they were my kinship adoptees. And then after they arrived and sort of landed and settled in our family, my wife and I went through a series of IVF and all kinds of stuff, really sort of struggling to get pregnant on our own. And after, you know, some tragedy in that space, we conceived my son naturally. And Seth was born in 2008. And it was just this incredible moment of recognizing that I had been adopted and I had a wonderful life, but that I had never, ever known a single biological relative in my entire life until Seth was born.
Wow.
And that was incredibly eye-opening and very emotional for me. I cried over him as I looked down on him. He was on his back, sort of kicking and flailing his legs. He had no idea why Dad was so emotional, but it was literally because of his existence. And that was what inspired me to sort of go out on my own to find my biological mother, because I realized that as Seth was a branch on my biological tree that I knew, I too at one point was a branch on someone else's biological tree, and I had no idea who that tree was connected to and where the roots were. So I decided that I wanted to search. To cut the story short a little bit, I took a job in the Obama administration at the Department of Health and Human Services here in Washington, D.C.
Nice.
And coincidentally, my birth mother was found by my social worker working 2 blocks away from me at the Federal Aviation Administration here in D.C. as well.
That is so crazy.
It was really wild. I was able to connect with her by phone the night before her next birthday.
Wow.
So when she told me that she worked at the FAA down the street, I said, there's no way I'm not going to find this woman tomorrow. And I decided I was going to surprise her.
Wow.
And that's what I did. So I went to her building, cleared security, went downstairs, and security had called her.
Oh, wow.
To let her know that I was there.
You told security what you were doing?
It's funny. I did. Security said, who are you here to see? And I said, I'm here to see Ann Sullivan. And the person said, what's her phone number? And I was like, I've never met her before. And I said that out loud. I don't know. I've never met her. But I knew what I was there for. So I could totally feel the discomfort of what I had just said. And I was like, oh my God, that sounds weird. You should fix that. So I told the security guard, I'm here to reunite with my biological mother. And her eyes got as big as saucers. And she dialed that phone so diligently. Aww. And she called down and she said, Miss Sullivan, there's a Damon Davis here to see you. And the guard gasped as she hung up the phone. And then she clicked the phone. And I said, why did you gasp? And she said, because she gasped.
Oh my gosh.
And that was how I knew how real that moment was.
Wow.
So she put me on the elevator, gave me instructions to go down to her office. But unbeknownst to me, Ann had gotten up from her desk and was coming up to meet me at the security desk.
Oh.
I'm standing in the elevator, sort of fixing my tie in the reflection of the back of the door. And the door opens. And before me is this woman whose face is my face.
Wow.
And she's looking at me like, oh my God, that's the guy in the pictures I received in that introductory letter. And I just dove on her, burst out crying, big, huge hug. And we had a wonderful lunch. And it was just a wonderful way to have an initial connection, was with a surprise on her birthday, only blocks from where I worked. So that meant that I could see her literally almost anytime I wanted to. I would be in between meetings and send her a text and say, hey, what are you doing? Yeah. And we would go out and get coffee, or we would go get lunch, or anything. It was amazing.
That's so amazing. And like I said in the intro, I think most adoptees, that's their dream. And you got it. And it never went sour either.
No, it really didn't.
It was beautiful. And then she passed pretty recently, right?
Yeah, she was with us for about 6 years. We were in reunion. And as a federal employee, she was approaching federal retirement. And so she took her time. And for the first time ever, she purchased a house in Santa Fe, New Mexico. She was very spiritual and she loved it out there. And as such, she moved, having, again, purchased the first home that she had ever owned in her entire life. And I went to visit her a couple of months later after her retirement, and we had a great time. And then just a few months after that, she was gone.
Wow.
It was absolutely unbelievable. But I was so thankful to have ever known her and to have gotten even the 6 years that I did. Yeah. And as you said, have it stay sweet and not go sour. There's a lot of adoption, reunion, rejection out there that is really tough for people to handle. And I choose those words carefully because I think sometimes we say words like secondary rejection, and it assumes, in my mind, that every single adoption is a result of a rejection of the child. And I don't believe that's true. My birth mother told me very honestly that she wished that she could have me back, that I wasn't being rejected. Yeah. She was placing me because of the situation that I was in.
Yes.
And so I begun to be very diligent about calling it what it is, that if it is an adoption reunion rejection, then we call it that. Now, I will admit, there are some people who are rejected at birth, right? The woman gets pregnant. She decides, I do not want to have this child. And that child, for all intents and purposes, is rejected. Yep. I get that. And in which case, they may experience a secondary rejection in their attempt to reunite an adoption reunion. But I don't choose to blanket call it secondary rejection for every person because I don't believe that that's true.
I think that's great.
So, yeah, we had a sweet relationship. Yeah. It was sad to see her go, but it was really wonderful and fulfilling to introduce her to Seth, to introduce her to my wife, and to just see how my face and my body look like another person that I'd never seen before for 36 years. It was crazy.
So amazing. You're just exuding gratitude, and it's so beautiful. It's such a wonderful story. And I know that your podcast, you talk to many adoptees, and it's so interesting to hear everybody's reunion story. But what percentage of the adoptees you interview on your show have a story like yours?
Gosh, I don't know. I think of a very small percentage of them do. Yeah. As with anything, events happen on a bell curve, right? Yeah. There's the sort of extreme awesomeness on the left, and I would characterize myself over there. There's the average in the top of the bell curve, the fat part, where most people have a positive adoption and a negative reunion, and it could be paternal or maternal. And so there's all this mix of where the positivity and negativity come from. And then there's the other end of the bell curve, which is just awful all the way through. It was a terrible adoption. It was a terrible reunion. And unfortunately, that person has lived what amounts to a very sad life.
Yeah.
And I really do feel for those folks.
Yeah, for sure.
I do count myself as being on the front end of two great stories, because my paternal reunion was also an amazing event as well.
Yeah. It took you a little while to find him, though.
Yeah, it did.
It was a little bit of a wild goose chase for a little bit there.
Yeah, it did. You're absolutely right. So when I first connected with my biological mother, she told me very candidly, I'm an open book, so you can ask me whatever you want. And of course, the first question I ask is, who's my biological father? And she named this guy, but I could sense the pain in her voice as she recalled what had happened and when she got pregnant. Mm-hmm. And so I realized that I was being given a gift of even reuniting with her in the first place, and that it was so awesome that quite literally it was obvious to me there was nowhere else to go but down from the reunion that she and I had had. Mm-hmm. So I chose not to look for this guy, and especially given the story. Basically, I was a product of an extramarital affair. Okay. And he was not supportive of her at that time. So I said, well, if he wasn't supportive of her then, like, I don't really need to know him now. I found her. I'm good. Yeah. But needless to say, when you think about the chemistry of how a child gets here, you realize there's two people involved. Yeah. And it would be a real shame if I left this earth and didn't actually try to find this other person. So after she passed, I tracked this guy down. And as I expected, it was not anywhere near the experience that I had had with Anne. We had no rapport. We were very different personalities. It was loud and kind of obnoxious, in my opinion. I just really wasn't feeling him. And so I was ready to let the relationship die. And then I made one last ditch and I said, you know what? You should just go see this guy. Just face him, suck it up, let him annoy you for a day, fly in, fly out. And when I called him to suggest it, he said, are you sure I'm the guy? And I said, well, I kind of know how these things work. And she said it was you. But ultimately, he signed off from our relationship. And he said, I'm sorry, Mr. Davis, I'm not the guy. And I was astonished. One, because, as an adopted person and you're trying to create a reunion with somebody, you think you have a lot to offer. So naturally, somebody's going to want to know you. And for him to sign off and say, nah, I'm not interested in knowing you, I was like, wow, that's really crazy. I never really anticipated that. But then in an ironic twist, my mother-in-law, who lives there in Los Angeles with you, is also an adoptee. Oh. And she has a younger daughter than my wife. And my sister-in-law, Stephanie, was saying, oh my God, mom's adopted. We should all do DNA tests and let's figure out who mom is, right? Okay. And I was like, that sounds really cool. We'll learn about mom. We'll learn about Michelle, my wife, and then we'll learn about Seth, my son. So I was not going into this with any intent to launch some kind of paternal reunion, but that's exactly what I got. I was looking at our results online one day, and astonishingly, I had two biological connections. One of them is obviously going to be Seth. So I was so curious to know who this other person was going to be. And it turned out that when you clicked on the data, it shows all of the centimorgans of how you're related. And this guy had more centimorgans in common with me than I had in common with my own son. Whoa, okay. And as you read across the line, it says, this person is your father. Whoa, that's pretty. And I was blown away. I mean, you can't even imagine. I'm sitting in bed and I read these words online. So to cut a long story short, I ended up locating him through some other biological family members. They connected us by phone. And coincidentally, the night we spoke by phone was the night before my wife, Michelle, and my son, Seth, and I were taking a trip to Los Angeles. And coincidentally, my birth father, Bill, lives in Las Vegas. Oh. So basically we were going to be in the same neighborhood, same part of the country, a short, 30, 40 minute flight. So I said, listen, I'm going to be out there. And if you want to connect, why don't we do so? And he said, yeah, let's do it. So we took a day trip and we flew out there and we had an amazing time because one, he picked us up from the airport. It was really funny. My wife tells this story because she and my son Seth hung back from me and my birth father, Bill, walking out of the airport together. So Bill and myself are in front. Michelle and Seth are in the back. And we had explained to Seth what we were doing, that we were meeting Dad's birth father. He had known my adoptive father, but we explained to him what his relation was to this guy, Bill. And Seth, walking next to his mom, tugs on her sleeve and he said, Mom, I'm kind of freaking out right now. It was really cute because he had totally gotten the gravity of the fact that I am standing next to my biological father, just the same as he is my biological son, and he was standing next to me.
Oh.
And in an interesting twist, Bill, my birth father, and Anne, my birth mother, both got into genealogy.
Oh.
So it was incredible. And when I met them, they each handed me an entire family history dating all the way back to the days of slavery in this country.
Wow.
So I have my ancestry chart is completely filled out by the folks who brought me into this world. It's absolutely just an amazing array of information.
Wow, so rare.
And he remains very, very close to me to this day. I just saw him this weekend. I was in Las Vegas and we had a great visit. So it's been great.
That is so wonderful. I'm so glad the other guy was not your father. And when I'm reading your book, and I was like, oh, shoo, dodge that bullet. Okay, good.
You and me both.
Yeah, I'm sure. There's so much ups and downs in reunion, no matter what. But I'm just wondering, I don't think you should have this, but do you have any sort of survivor guilt, or like you talk to so many other adoptees that have so much more painful stories.
Yeah.
I'm sure you're just filled with gratitude, but does any part of you go like, God, I kind of got off lucky?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I've made this analogy before that an adoption story is like, you ever seen a big soundboard in a sound studio? Yeah. It's got all these dials and levers and you can move all this stuff. Mm-hmm. With the slide of any one of my adoption story levers, anything could have been very different, right? Mm-hmm. You slide one lever and I could have been an interracial adoptee, or another and I could have been in a negative adoption experience full of abuse and neglect, or even just microaggressions. It doesn't even have to be big stuff. Sometimes what really kills me about the stories that I hear are the microaggressions from the parents to the adoptee. Yeah. Like, you better be careful. We'll take you back there. Like, don't do that. That's awful. Right?
Yeah, that's terrible.
And there are also reminders for the adoptees that they are adopted. I consider myself lucky because I grew up in a homogenous family where when we walked out in public, mom's black, dad's black, and Damon's black right in the middle. And we look like family. Yeah. So the question of adoption is not on the table at the outset.
Right.
I spoke to an adoptee recently and she said one of the big challenges for her, she said, I love my parents very much. And I'm really appreciative of everything that I've ever experienced. But it's challenging for me to walk out in public with them because everybody can see that I'm adopted. She's a woman of color and her parents are white. Yep. And she said, everybody can see that I'm adopted. And I have to live something that's very personal about myself out in the public eye. Yeah. And when she said that, I knew it intuitively, but she articulated it so well that you have to live your private adoption out where others can see. Yeah. That's something that we all need to be cognizant of. Yeah, definitely. So yes, I do consider myself extremely lucky, especially as compared with some of the stories that I've helped to share.
And still, you're not just sitting there, with your little pile of gold and holding it to yourself. You're sharing your story, you're opening your platform to other adoptees, you're speaking out, you're doing things to help everybody. So I really admire that, because it would be easy for someone like you to just go, well, I don't know what everyone else's problem is. Adoption's fine.
Yeah. Well, this is actually really interesting because this was the inspiration for the podcast itself. I came up with the title because it was quite literally a question that I sort of contemplated. If I'm adopted and I'm related to someone else, then who am I really?
Yeah.
Right.
It's the root question of everything, right?
Yeah, exactly. That was another reason why I thought that the title was so interesting, is because people often go through a journey of self-discovery and try to figure out, like, who am I really in my friend group, in my community, in this whatever. But the reason the podcast was initiated was because I would tell that miraculous story that I just shared with you, and I would share it widely. Like, it's an amazing story. I love telling it. And I would occasionally meet another adopted person and they would say, oh my gosh, that's so amazing. I'm really happy for you, but that'll never happen for me. And I say, why? And they would say things like, well, I was born in XYZ state and the birth records are closed there.
Yes.
Or I have thought about searching, but I get the sense from my adoptive parents that they're not supportive at all. So I can't do it. Or I have found my biological relatives and they don't want to know me. Yeah. And it was in telling my story and getting those responses that I realized how varied the adoption experience really is. I was living the adoption experience that has been Hollywoodified, right? This child gets scooped up, put in a family, raised awesome, great reunion, bam, we fix that, right? And that's not how it always goes.
Yeah.
They call it coming out of the fog, where I really began to realize what adoption means, that a child is taken from one family. And by the way, it's never for a good reason. I've started to tell people this too. We have to remember that adoption never starts from a truly positive place. I haven't spoken to one single adoptee on my show that has said, I met my biological family. They said everything was awesome.
Yep.
They just decided one day that I was going to be put up for adoption.
Yeah.
That's never, ever, ever the case.
No.
So it was when I realized that adoption starts from some level of adversity. And in many instances, the adoption placement is also sometimes in a place of adversity, right? Sometimes one or both of the parents are not able to conceive, or they have conceived and they've lost a child, or you name the thing. Some folks are not in a relationship but want to be a parent. And so there's some kind of challenge in the adoptive home that also, for lack of better words, necessitates or creates desire for adoption. So you've got these two adverse situations where you bring a child into the mix, and then everybody is expected to go forth in a positive way when there are some past traumas in both camps
all around
that deserve to be addressed so that everybody can move forward in a healthy way. And then finally, I'll just close with this. It's so natural then for an adoptive child to want to know who they really are, who they came from. And I think adoptive parents need to be very cognizant of the fact that in most cases, we are so very grateful and love you guys so much for everything that you've ever done. Truly. Because you were the parents. You were there bedside sick. You were there at practice. You were there for graduations and so many other things. But to be biologically related to someone else is something you just can't fight. And so to have that natural desire to want to meet biological family is something that needs space to be explored. And you need to let adoptees do that. And if you're not supportive, they will do it without you. And you'll get cut out.
That's right.
And that can hurt even worse. So I think it's really important that folks recognize that. And not every reunion goes well.
For sure.
Sometimes the adoptee is reminded of how awesome their family actually is. And they're like, oh my God, I'm so glad you're my parents. And so you have to allow space for that too.
Adoptive parents, it's nothing personal. It's nothing against us as adoptive parents that our kids want to find out where they came from. That's totally natural and logical. But God, get out of their way. Get out of the way or help. You could help.
Help.
That would be good.
In the best way that you can. And I think to admit your own insecurity. Right? You can say, and you should practice this before the situation comes up, because when the situation comes up, you don't want to do it wrong. So you got to think to yourself, if my daughter comes to me and says she wants to search, I think the first thing I want to say is, I'm so glad you came to me with this, right?
Nice.
Just acknowledge what was said. I'm so glad you shared this with me. Then you could say something like, I need a little bit of time to think this through, but I so want to help you and I want to be there for you. You've both admitted that you got to think about it, but that you're supportive, right?
Right.
And you may not choose the language that I've chosen, but I highly encourage you practicing what you want to say, because how many times have you been in a situation where something pops up and you said something and afterwards you're like, damn, I wish I didn't say that. And this is not the place to do it with your kid. And
acknowledging the complexities, I think most adoptees, adults anyway, would understand. You're like, God, I really want to help you. And I'm a little scared that you might leave me because you might like them better.
That's exactly right.
We have feelings about it too, but we cannot let our feelings trump whatever's happening with the adoptee. They get to lead the situation and we get to help if we want to help, or just let them do what they need to do. But gosh, there's so much pain involved in reunion that doesn't need to happen because it comes from the adoptive parents. And I also know a lot of adoptees who waited until their adoptive parents were gone. And then sometimes their birth parents are gone too. You wait too long.
I know.
Time is ticking along, people. So let's get out of everybody's way and let them go do what they need to do. So I totally with you on that. So tell us a little bit about how you became an adoptive parent, and were you out of the fog at that point or not? And how did you view adoption when you adopted? And then did it change once you adopted?
Yeah, great question. So I was not out of the fog, as it were, but I did recognize that as an adopted person, that there's a lot of positivity that can come from adoption. And I say those words carefully because it doesn't always come from adoption, but it can. And I knew that I was a product of that. This is a guy who grew up in a middle-class family, went to college, went to grad school, got an MBA, and has traveled the world.
Yeah.
And a lot of that probably would not have happened or would have happened very differently and much later if I had stayed with my biological mother, who was young, not expecting a child, not planning for me, not economically ready, and was going to be socially stigmatized, both in her family and in her society. So we say that adoption doesn't offer a better life. It offers a different life. Yeah. And I have a different life than I would have led with my mother, my biological mother, Anne. And I recognized that I could offer with my wife, Michelle, a different life for our kids. And so we elected to do so. And that was a lot based on my own personal experience as an adopted person. Yeah. I'll say we did the best we could. And like any parent on this planet, we made our mistakes, right?
Sure.
Even as an adopted person, I can say, you know, one of the things that was challenging in our relationship with our kids was that they had some attachment disorders, right? They grew up with a mother who left them for various reasons in the family. And they were left with their father, and their father left them with his grandmother, their great grandmother.
Wow.
So they were not necessarily being parented in a way that was commensurate with what a young child needs. They were in the care of a great grandparent who was not able to sort of keep up with them.
I bet.
And so they ended up starting to bounce around from place to place. They went to aunts and uncles and friends of the family overseas and this, that, and the other. And then they came to us in the United States. So they were born in the Caribbean.
Okay.
And to come to the United States is a difference of literally everything.
Yeah. And how old were they then when they came to you?
They were 9 years old each when they came. So my girl, Carissa, came when she was 9. And then her brother, Sam, came 2 years later when he was 9.
Oh, I see.
So at 9 years old, like you've lived a little bit, you know what I mean?
Yeah, you're
like
already formed, yeah.
You're not an adult, but if you've been overseas and been back and seen that the world wants to pass you around from place to place, then you do develop some attachment disorders. And it became very hard for them to accept what we were trying to offer as parents.
Yeah.
And we tried very hard. And one of the mistakes that I'll admit to was our son got really tough. He discovered he had a lot more freedoms when he went to public school than he had in private school.
Okay.
And that really sent him off the rails. And we saw that what his personality required was a lot of structure. So we sent him away to military school. Okay. And I say that because basically what happened was he got sent away again. Right. And I didn't calculate that was a message we were sending. Is that, okay, now you can't stay here anymore, on to your next place.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's a catch-22 because it was a rough time. I mean, it was disruptive in the house. And he turned out to really need those structural supports that military school provides. I mean, just wonderful performance in military school. Okay. But still, the underlying message is you don't get to stay here. Yeah. This was temporary. Now you go there. And I don't know how I could have done it any differently, but I want to just acknowledge that was one of the challenges that we faced.
Our son, we sent him away to a lockdown psych unit at one point, and that was a horrible place, it turned out. But I also did not navigate that great because for an adoptee, that just will trigger. But I know people send their kids to wilderness or to residential treatment centers, and it is sometimes absolutely necessary if they're not safe where they're at. If you've used up all the tools you've got, you sometimes do have to send them away. But I think, I don't know, looking back, it was so chaotic and it was just kind of an emergency to send him away. It's probably the same way with your son. Yeah. But maybe there was some sort of therapist that could have helped us with that transition. I don't know.
Yeah.
Do you have any ideas?
But as you said, these situations are emergency, right? They don't just you don't really plan for them over time. You have this crap moment.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you just start looking for resources,
Yeah.
and it's really tough. We did the same with our girl child. Carissa was sent away to a wilderness camp and sent to a facility for a short while as well.
Mm-hmm.
And, really tough, really, really tough. But the message was never underscored with, and this is not your home. You always get to come home.
Right. Yes, that helps.
And so I hope that was something that they took away from some of their experiences.
Yeah. And just a note, I understand that 30 to 40% of people in wilderness and residential treatment centers are adoptees.
Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Gosh.
And they're like 2 or 3% of the population, I think, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's an extraordinarily large number. And so you go, well, geez, why? And, the why is all the trauma, the attachment, the acting out is trying to express something. I need something and I'm not getting it. And it's so hard. It's so hard on everybody, but it's really sad.
Yeah, I agree.
That those places are filled with adoptees and foster kids too. It's like,
Yeah. And then our criminal justice system is disproportionately represented with foster children and adoptees.
Yeah, it's huge. And when you do those intakes, my son was involved with so many different healthcare situations. 0 of them asked, were you adopted or fostered? I think maybe people should ask that. But that would also require people to do something with that data and go, oh, you're adopted. Let's see, there's this extra special therapy over here, or extra special attachment treatment, blah, blah, blah. I don't even know what. Here's a horse to raise or a dog to raise or something to help you learn to attach. But no, that would cost a lot of money and take expertise that people are not willing to provide, I guess.
Yeah, but you raise a good point. There's this issue of trying to figure out, quote, what's wrong with somebody, right? And there's this great book with Oprah Winfrey and Bruce Perry, but it's quite literally called What Happened to You. And it's a great book because it does exactly what you just talked about. Instead of saying, just diving in for information, were you adopted or not? That's the what happened to you question that I think this book is trying to get to. Tell me more about how you got to this moment of needing support, right? Not what's wrong with you, because that's a very different question.
Yes.
And that puts the challenge of being an adoptee who was taken from one family situation and placed into another as the responsible party for that decision.
Yes.
And that's not the case.
Yeah.
It's what happened to them, not what is wrong with them.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really important point you make.
And when you think about just the relinquishment trauma, and then like in your kids' case, all the bouncing around and instability, and of course they're going to have struggles, especially in their teen years. Of course they're going to grab cannabis. It's a great way to just numb it all out.
Yeah.
Just all starts to make sense if we can destigmatize and just kind of go, oh, let's help you with this piece over here and try to pull it all together. How are your kids doing now, or what part of it are you willing to share?
It's funny. So I've got 2 older and 1 younger, and the younger guy is doing pretty well. The 2 older ones are struggling, if I'm honest. My son, the last I knew, unfortunately, was homeless in Los Angeles. And that was after, again, multiple levels of support. We helped him to move out there with the hope that the structure we provided would allow him housing. He had a car. He was enrolled in school. The goal was to get him into a 4-year school and then help him to launch. And to just be short, he did all of the opposite things, the opposing things, to let any of those pieces of support be successful. And he blamed us for a lot and unfortunately just signed off. And so haven't seen or talked to him in years.
I'm so sorry.
And I can only hope that he's in some way making it, surviving, and on his way to thriving. I truly wish him the absolute best. And my daughter's been challenged herself. She made some decisions on her own that were, not in her own best interest. And I think in some ways she wasn't even equipped to try to face some of the things that she needed to. And unfortunately, some of that poor decision making just led her down a path that has not got her in her productive part of society either. So the 2 of them are challenged, and it's been really tough. As an adoptive parent, you go into it with the intention of pouring everything you've got into the child and doing all you can for them. But at some point you realize that you're doing all the work and they're not taking up any piece. You know, they say many hands make light work. And if I'm the only one lifting, then we're not lifting your life up together.
Yeah.
And we had to make some hard decisions about how we were going to let these guys make their own decisions and let the consequences of those decisions accrue to them, as my wife says.
Yeah.
She said, you know, all these things these guys do, the consequences accrue to us. And I told her, we have to be in a position now of taking away the parachute. We always rescue them before they land and hit the concrete. And unfortunately, that parachute has to go away or else they're not going to get it. They're always going to think we're going to be there. And it was like, it's by far one of the toughest things I've ever had to do.
It's really tough. I also try not to work harder than my son. You know, for a while there, I was scrambling around trying to fix him, you know, trying to do this, that, trying to find him the right people to help. And he didn't want the help.
Yeah.
And he still is kind of pushing back a little bit and just struggling. But if we keep making it super easy for them to continue dysfunctional behavior, it kind of perpetuates it. But it's tough. Did you have the feeling like, even though I know you love your children, I love my son so much, but do you ever have the feeling like this is not anything like what I imagined this would be?
Yeah, I think it's impossible to say that everything goes to plan. There hasn't been a single thing in my life that's gone according to plan, quite literally.
Yeah.
And parenting is no different, even with my biological son. So I know we're talking about adoptees, but I'm going to use my biological son as an example because I grew up on soccer, lacrosse, and hip hop, right?
Okay.
And my son had a nanny who introduced him to country music, and he's a gamer and likes to draw. You know what I mean? Like my plan was to have a mini me, and I ended up getting some independent kid who I totally didn't plan for. But that's what we do is we go into parenting with the understanding that this child is probably going to pick up some of what I am putting down. And they're going to find some pathways of their own. And you absolutely have to accept it. And that was true for the adoptees too. Yeah. And I think part of good parenting is allowing that space for exploration so that the child can figure out quite literally who they really are. Yeah. And it takes some experimentation.
I think about my own parents, and I certainly did not turn out the way they wanted either. I think I turned out pretty good, but I'm lesbian, I'm liberal, I'm Unitarian, you know, just check all the boxes. I'm not what they wanted me to be when they raised me, but we still are in connection and we still love each other. And I think that's the hard part about parenting because you just get this child, however you get them, born or adopted or fostered or whatever. And your job is just to love them, whoever they are.
Yeah.
Whatever they turn out to be. So, oh gosh, it's so hard just to continue to let go and stay connected, like let go and stay connected. So hard.
Yeah, it's tough. It's tough.
Did you notice any other interesting contrasts between your biological child and the adopted children? And I know you had the adopted children when they were quite a bit older, 9 years old, you got them, but do you have a different kind of bond with your biological child because you have had him since in utero or? Yeah,
I think that is, listen, anybody who can't admit that that's a thing is kind of lying to themselves. Let's be honest, right? Because to know that you and another person got together and created a third person is a special bond in and of itself.
Yeah.
And it's a special bond to bring an adopted person into your family and focus on them from that perspective, right?
Yep.
And similarly, I'm not equating these things, but let's say that one of my children had been special needs. That bond with having a child with special needs would be different than my other biological child and one of my adopted children. Like I say that to say that every single one of these parenting situations is different. Yeah. And it's impossible to sort of ignore. I'm not sure if I answered your question. And they're not better or worse necessarily, but definitely there's a different bond when they're biologically related to you. There's genetics is like a real thing. Yeah. And just the time too. You know, I missed the first 7.5 months of my child's life. And sometimes I look at a little baby. I don't really like babies. It really triggers me, but because I got into adoption through infertility. So there's a lot of layers there. But when I see a kid about his age, I sometimes ask the parents, can you imagine
starting from here and missing all the stuff. And sometimes they're like, yeah, I wish I could have missed all that sleepless nights and stuff. But most of the time they're like, wow, that's a lot of time to miss.
Yeah.
All those milestones, all those things that happen in those first only 7 months. And you had 9 years of your kids' lives that you weren't there for and just had to start picking up. It's just weird.
Exactly. I mean, to go back, you're absolutely right. I was there the moment my son was taken from his mother's body. And I've been with him ever since. And I was reflecting on myself. The first picture I have of myself, I'm sitting upright, fully dressed. I was 3 months old.
Wow.
Right. So for 3 months of my life, no clue where I was.
Oh, nobody knows.
No clue who I was with.
Wow.
Don't know what we were doing. It's crazy. So all of that to say, it is a very different experience. Then you take my 2 older kids. They came to me when they were 9 years old. You know how many school days, family vacations and outings, Christmases and holiday seasons, birthday parties and stuff you've missed
so much.
By the time a child gets to be 9 years old?
Yeah.
They've got their own idea of the world by that time, right?
For sure.
They know what they like and don't like. You don't have to sit there and try to figure out what they mean with a certain noise or a certain gesture or whatever because they're pre-verbal.
Yeah.
They just get up and say, I'm hungry. They go to the kitchen. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's a completely different experience to bring in an adopted child.
Yeah.
And I think we have to respect that for what it is.
And so much trauma can happen in those years or months or days, however much. Even if adoptive parents get their child from the hospital the day after they're born, there's the trauma of the relinquishment and the separation from their mother.
Absolutely. 100%. If I've been living in my mother's womb for multiple months until I'm birthed, I've heard her voice. Basically, we've eaten the same food and drank the same drinks. I've heard all of the noises that she's been exposed to in the outside world. And, I'm quite sure that if you come out of the womb and you meet new people immediately, if you were a baby, I'm quite sure you would look over your shoulder and go, what? Where's that other lady? You know what I mean?
Yes.
So.
I think that's very important for people to understand. Yeah, definitely. I got into a little spat once on social media with somebody that didn't like how I called somebody a natural parent. Birth parents sometimes like to be called natural parents because they did more than just birth the child. It's like, anyway, so she didn't like the word natural, and she was an adoptive parent and did not like that adoptive parents were not considered natural. Like, well, they're not. Yeah. They're not. What do you want to do?
The very definition of nature indicates that, you had some. I'm with you. I don't see how an adoptive parent can lay claim to being natural. So I'm not sure why that happened. But
it's a defensive stance, and it feels like we're trying to create hierarchies or levels of parents. But we can say, okay, adoptive parents are not natural, but we're still valued and needed sometimes. And we can help our kids thrive, or we can make things worse for them.
Yeah.
That's our
exactly
choice.
Right.
It's not that we're better or worse or great or horrible. It's just the way things are. It's just the way things are. Yeah.
That's exactly right.
What advice do you have for adoptive parents, since you've been on both sides of this situation?
I think adoptive parents need to acknowledge their own trauma, right? Acknowledge, and it's multiple levels too. It's not just why you had to be an adoptive parent if it was necessitated. It's also like, how were you raised?
Yes. Whatever attachment issues you have.
So I think we need to sort of be an acknowledgement of what we do and don't want to be as a parent, both from how we were raised and how we're an adoptive parent. I think it's important to be open with the child. This thing where I'm going to wait to tell the child at the right time. Think of how many times you've waited for the right time for something and then it was too late.
Yeah.
There's no right time. Right times don't exist. Get over it and acknowledge that you need to share this adoption with the child, because if you don't, you're going to end up creating a surprise. And that surprise is yet another trauma. And that will be your own doing for not acknowledging it.
Yep. Tell them from day one. Yeah. Just tell them, the secrets are so toxic. Yeah.
Yep.
For anything, and secrets about any piece of it, at age appropriate levels, they just need to know.
Yeah.
Even if it's a ugly story, it's their story and they need to know it.
Yep.
That's tough. But yeah, there's going to be no time that's going to come and say, okay, this is the time.
Yeah.
It's not going to
right.
land on your, on your lap. Okay.
Right.
You just got to make a time and just do it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I totally agree. Is there anything else you'd like to talk about? Anything else that you'd like to share that I didn't ask you about?
No, I think you did a wonderful job. I mean, I think for an adoptive parent, it's really important to be open and honest, and that it can make a bond for you and your kids. And I think that's something we need to be very cognizant of.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I'm so grateful that Damon, you were here to share your story with our audience. And I wish you and your family all the best. Please go listen to Damon's podcast called Who Am I Really? And read his memoir, Who Am I Really? And continue to follow his journey. Thank you for listening to this episode. Please share it with anyone you think might resonate with this information. And if you'd like to support the podcast, you can do so by becoming a Patreon member. Go to patreon.com/unraveling adoption and you can support us with $5 a month or more. And we'd really appreciate it. It helps us pay for the software and allows us to keep this commercial free. And I do have a group for adoptive parents called Aptitude. If you're interested and you're an adoptive or foster parent, please go find information about it at our website, unravelingadoption.com. And in a couple of weeks, you guys, I'm going to be starting a coaching practice. So keep your eyes open for opportunities to get group or individual coaching with me. I'm very excited to be working one-on-one and in small groups of 3 to 6 people in my new coaching practice, which will be starting very soon. So keep an eye out. Thanks again for listening. And Damon and I want you all to stay
safe.